Hello, this is Don Davis from the Happy Lab at GSU. That's the Humility and the Advancement of Positive Psychology Interventions Lab. I've got a time limit on what I can do in this screencast, so without further ado, let's get into it. So, first of all, what is a literature review? This is a certain kind of paper. It's more than just what you see at the beginning of an empirical paper where they kind of do a funneling towards the topic of study. This is a systematic literature review where you're going to do a very specific kind of search to find all the articles that fit in a certain set of parameters, and you're going to find all the empirical articles in that area, and then you're going to review them in some way, either qualitatively or quantitatively. So a qualitative review is called just that. When you do a quantitative literature review, you call it a meta-analysis. Okay, so the first step in the process is to find a topic for the lit review, and this is probably one of the more challenging steps. You don't want to pick something that has already been done before, so it's worth spending a little extra time because lit reviews take a lot of energy. So spend some time and make sure that this area hasn't been reviewed recently. Number two, you have to do some work to kind of get to the right area, right level of specificity. What that means is we want to find a topic that has somewhere between 20 and 30 studies for a thesis or dissertation project. Sometimes that's not as easy as it sounds, but when you do a lit review, you're claiming to have done a comprehensive lit search in a certain area where you've tried to find every empirical article on a certain topic, and you carefully record the steps that are involved in that search process. So some of the top tier review journals, sometimes articles may have as many as 100 or even 200 studies reviewed, but for a first-time literature review, it's very much ambitious to do something between 20 and 30 studies. That gives you plenty to talk about. Okay, I wanted to give you a little bit of an example of what this looks like. So say we wanted to do a search on the topic of humility, and we were doing this in PsycInfo. I might enter the term humility, and I could narrow that to just titles or just abstracts, but I'm going to leave it open to any field. And then it's probably best to just include any studies and not cut down on the parameters of the search, and you're going to be filtering through a lot of non-empirical papers. A shortcut, just when you're trying to narrow on a topic, is to click empirical studies, and that'll give you a more narrow sense of which studies would fall into your search. Now, sometimes people miscode, so it's actually better to do the broader search when you're doing the final version. Which you hit search, and then it gives you a list. Okay, there's 271 so-called empirical articles on humility. This is what I did for my dissertation. There ended up being a lot of studies that had the word humility in them that I was able to cut those out of my search. So, for example, a lot of studies on modesty, or some studies on narcissism will use the word humility, but I was able to cut out a lot of studies from my dissertation search. So this gives you some sense of you're going to have some way of narrowing in on a topic where the actual number of empirical papers that you review is not more than, certainly 35 or 40. Another tool that I wanted to show you is called Hardings Publish or Perish, and this search engine is really nice when you're reviewing a much larger literature. So you can type in your search as usual, And over here you've got different ways that you can kind of cut down on the number of areas that are reviewed, types of journals that are reviewed. And then what it does is it searches for some time on Google Scholar. This links up with Google Scholar, and it will stop at 100 results. So you can limit the year span to get more and more studies. But I usually just use this as a tool of seeing what's out there. And what you can do is you can sort it by year and citations. So what this does is, as we're looking through, in the year 2011, it shows us the most cited humility articles. So there's something about intervention, humility, and animal integrity that's not in a psychology journal. It looks like there's this handbook article, which is a chapter. It's been cited 4 times. One of my papers has been cited 4 times, and downward. Then if we back up to 2010, there's some philosophy paper that's cited over 200 times, something else that's not in sight. And then there's this paper on honesty, humility, which is a 6-factor version of the Big 5 that's been cited 14 times. There's a leadership paper that's talking about humility, more of a theoretical paper. Several honesty, humility type papers. This is my lit review that we did on measurement strategies and a new model of looking at humility. So this gives you a flavor of how you could use a tool like this to see what the more important articles are in a certain field. And then you can actually save this very quickly into an Excel file by doing what I just did. And so we type in humility search, save it. So we talked briefly about how to choose a topic. The next phase is the next step is to decide what kind of review to do. So if you are going to do more of a qualitative review, that's one methodological path. The other path is to do something more quantitative called a meta-analysis. An example of that, I did a meta-analysis on the correlation between religion, spirituality, so any measure of religion, spirituality, and forgiveness. And so I found every study that reported that particular correlation. And I looked at, how strong is that relationship, and I looked at a variety of moderators of that relationship. So you can, for example, compare how strong that relationship is when you look at trait measures of forgiveness, so how forgiving a person is across time and situations, or if you look at how forgiving they are of a specific offense. And so we talked about this the other day in our lab meeting, but one of the main findings of our meta-analysis was that higher people who are more religious tend to report being more forgiving in general when you look at measures that have higher social desirability bias. But when you look at forgiveness of specific offenses, so real life offenses, religiosity is not very strongly correlated. So the correlation was 0.10, which is 1% of the variance. So, okay, step 3. So I showed you a little bit of this already, actually, but what you're going to do is you're going to do searches within several search engines. So PsycInfo is one that we usually use, and if you go to that same kind of search engine, you can actually check a lot of different search engines, even within EBSCOhost there. Google Scholar would be another one that is a much broader search. And so if you use just those 2, that would be a fairly rigorous search. And then typically people will also write in that they reviewed the reference sections of some of the review papers that were or some of the lit reviews of papers in the search. And so that's another way of finding additional articles that you may not have found. And then towards the end of the search, what you'll do is you'll send out an email to some of the first authors of papers or the corresponding authors, and you'll ask them if they have any unpublished papers. And this is important because a lot of times it's easier to get papers published if you kind of find an interesting finding, or if you find something that kind of fits what's expected in the field. So it's important to get, in order for the review to be accurate, the articles that didn't make it to the light of day. And very important, you have to keep track of specifically what you did in the search. In a minute, I'll show you where we put it. Okay, the fourth step is to make a chart. So you make a table where you enter certain information in for any study that you read. So the different columns for this will be the author, whether the study is published or not, the research design of the study, information about the participants, so sample size, gender, age, sexual orientation of the samples, those kind of things. The measures that were used will be a column, the effect size, and then the summary of the main findings of that study. Okay, and finally, start writing. You just start sketching in the different parts of the paper once you've made your table and you're kind of ready to summarize what you found. This is easier said than done. This section tries to kind of break it into more manageable parts. I think what I'm going to do at this point is get an example of a lit review and kind of walk you through the different parts of that paper. Okay, so this is the title page of the paper. Just follow APA guidelines for that. You got an abstract. And the first part of the paper is very similar to some other papers where you're just working from broad to narrow, so given some sense of an outline of what's going to come in the paper. We've got a section on definitions. And then we're starting to set up why it's important to do a lit review. So there's been a meta-analysis in this area that was fairly recent, so we had to kind of address what we were going to do specific in our area. And then we kind of tell this story about how there's been a shift in the focus in the field in what's been looked at in the relationship between religion, spirituality, and forgiveness. So you'll get kind of a sense of what it looks like to theoretically kind of set up a paper. And then we're explaining each of the hypotheses that we're going to look at in this particular meta-analysis. We describe, the shift to looking at spirituality as a dynamic construct, and it works its way towards the hypothesis there. And then we describe that there hasn't been much done on forgiveness of self, and work our way towards the hypothesis there. And then a summary of what we're going to do in the meta-analysis. This is really the method section of the paper. So we've got a review, and then we describe our method in the review. We describe really specifically what studies were included in the paper. We described what types of measures of spirituality we were going to look at in code for, measures of forgiveness, measures of state forgiveness, measures of self-forgiveness. So we're summarizing the types of measures that are in the lit review. And then this is the paragraph where we describe it specifically what we did in our search. We describe what kind of effect size we're going to code for and look at. We detailed what we did specifically with missing data in the study. And then we reported how many abstracts that we looked at overall. So this was a fairly massive lit review. Yours probably won't have this many abstracts that you review, but I had close to 1,500 that we looked through and pulled studies from. And then I reported how many were eventually used. And then I walked through our coding procedures in the study, as well as the data analysis that we ran. So using a meta-analysis program. And then finally, I walked through the specific results of the study.